this part of it. So let's. Can somebody do me a favor and just sort of summarize the Farsi Island case study for me? This is Doug had mentioned yesterday that there is a case study that we are introducing to our students as plebes, as youngsters, as second class, and as firsties through the different lenses of the loose haul courses they're taking. And it's a good study to choose because it gives you leverage on ethics, on leadership, and the law. And it's also a good case study in that Lieutenant Narker, when he was confronted with this situation, which as an 06 with 26 years of experience, I would not want to be confronted with. He was pretty fresh out of the Naval Academy. So, this is one of those, hey, this is coming your way. Can somebody kind of just give me a very brief thumbnail sketch of the incident?
You want me to do it, Roger?
You got it, Jim.
So this is a couple of small boats are coming out of Bahrain. They're making a transit, and there's all sorts of issues. They have, they're behind, so we have the time element. They're behind in what they need to do. One of the boats has an engine issue, and it's kind of got to be jury rigged. And so they, because they have a time crunch, they decide to take a little shortcut, and they end up in Iranian territorial waters and are immediately surrounded by some Iranian gunboats. And the guns are trained down on both boats. And then I think this is one of our questions on our final. And then the question is, okay, you're Lieutenant so-and-so, and what do you do now?
Yeah, that's a good summary. And one sort of, and I'm not even sure if this was in the case study as we wrote it up, but they kind of, Lieutenant Narker is kind of, it's like, what island is that? So they were a little bit confused as to whether or not they were, where they actually were when they were confronted. So yeah, and now
they didn't. Yeah, I'm sorry, Rod. I missed that. They had a system, a navigation system nobody knew how to use. So there was a lot of confusion about where they were. They didn't deliberately do it. They just were they didn't know they didn't know where they were.
Right. So they get their engines ready to go right on time, right in time to get away. But boat number 802 shuts down. Two Iranian boats basically seal them off, so they can't go anywhere. And now you, as Lieutenant Narker, are confronted with a choice. Do I defend my boat, or do I surrender my crew? And Marcus, if you could flip it to the next slide. Okay. And I just I think we can do this fairly quickly. So is this a routine moral choice? Anybody think this is a routine moral choice? I know exactly what to do.
I had this on the drive-in today.
How much time does Lieutenant Narker have to make this choice?
30 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably seconds. Although you also have to understand that this scenario is developing over a little bit of time. So as they're sitting there, they're seeing the boats coming in. They're saying, "Hurry up!" They probably don't know that they're going to be boarded, but he's probably thinking this is a possibility. So it's not exactly a millisecond type of decision that he has to make. He's got maybe a few minutes to start thinking about, okay, what ifs. This next one might be an interesting question. Is this just a test of integrity, or is this a no kidding moral dilemma? In other words, do you know the right and wrong thing to do, or is that uncertain? Maybe let me do this. Would anybody argue that this is not a moral dilemma?
No, I definitely don't know the right.
Okay. Yeah. Good. So I think we're on the same sheet of music here. So what happens? What do we do if we find ourselves in a moral dilemma?
Break out the MDRs.
You pull out the MDR. You pull out the moral deliberation roadmap. Marcus, over to you.
Okay. So we are going to talk about this case and use the moral deliberation roadmap. I'm going to talk a little bit about it first. I'm going to say that, so first of all, stop me with any questions at any point. Second, just as a useful kind of your own knowledge, everything that Roger has kind of been talking about is things that we tell our students and is in our class, right? It's obviously, there's a lot more in the class. We don't have just 3 hours, but what I'm going to talk about next for a little bit is a little bit kind of behind the veil, just to let you know about why we have the moral deliberation roadmap and what's going on there, and why it's a little bit different than the way you might see it somewhere else. So if you were to take a philosophy class or an ethics class at any other school, especially if it was taught by a philosopher, philosophers care a lot about ontology, which is, you know, a word that most people don't even know, so philosophers have to love it, right? So it's the study of what is, right? Being what makes something the thing that it is. An example I often use here is like, there's a, you know, people disagree about what makes a cup a cup. It's a question that only a philosopher would even care about or think to ask, right? So the Taoists, Lao Tzu, if you ever read the Tao Te Ching, most likely a kind of composite character. But the Taoists think that it's the emptiness, it's the nothing, right? That's the key feature, in fact, is the ability to have space to put something into. And you know, people like John Locke think it's more about like the way that the cup is shaped on the outside, and you know. But once again, no one really cares about this. I had to read a whole book on the ontology of wholes in graduate school, but it wasn't fun. I don't recommend it. So in ethics, more specifically, what you're going to focus on in a lot of introductory ethics classes, and if you took an ethics class at like a major research university, I would be shocked if it didn't focus primarily on the question of what is it that makes something like right, good, pious, and these questions go back, you know, in Western philosophy, at least to Plato. So if you've ever read Socrates' Euthyphro, this is a discussion about what makes an action pious or good or right. And that's what philosophers, at least, not people. Philosophers are people, but they're certainly not most people, care about. And so if you take a class, in philosophy, at kind of in ethics at any kind of major university, you're probably going to get a lot of different answers to that question. 3 very common ones are principles, consequences, and character. And you might, obviously, being theories of what makes an action right, it's going to be much more complex than that. And there are other ways to carve this out, but that's kind of the way things, that's one way of kind of thinking about things. Things get pretty difficult pretty quickly, and I think this is easiest by looking at consequences, right? So let's say you really believe, and some people believe this, that what makes an action right or good is that it makes the world better, right? Any action makes the world better, that makes people, let's say, happier, or brings about more rights, or brings about more human flourishing, or however you want to do it, right, is better. You don't have to be a human for very long to realize human beings are really bad at figuring out consequences, right? So geez, God, the last year is certainly an example, right? But even before that, you know, like if you walk into any casino and you just watch people playing blackjack, which is a really simple game with really simple rules, and people do just like vastly irrational choices, right? And life is so much more complicated than that, right? So, so what a lot of people say is, oh yeah, it's the consequences that make things right, but that doesn't mean that everyone should do a consequential analysis of every action, right? So then really quickly we realize things come apart about like, how do I determine what an action is right or good versus what like makes it right or good? And if you're a theorist, if you're a philosopher, you're going to say, yeah, and what I care about is the question about like what makes it right or good. And I still care about those things, and we all probably care about those, and that's an important question. But in a case like this, or in cases like we reach in our daily lives, we probably don't care about that as much, right? We're just trying to figure out, how do I determine what the right thing to do is? So what we did here at the Naval Academy is we said, let's look at kind of historical thinkers and the way that they've thought about this and develop a way, just a schema to think about, to try and capture at least most of, if not all of the morally salient features so that we can at least be more deliberate about the way we deliver that. It's not perfect. There's certainly different ways that you could carve this up. We debate amongst each other. This is not just unique to us, though. If you look at other areas of applied ethics, it's a pretty interesting recent trend that more people are looking at what philosophers call the principle level, right? Thinking about like, what are the kinds of factors that we care about, and less about the theoretical foundational level. So Shirley was talking about one of her students is a doctor, and I find that really fascinating because medical ethics is one of the areas where they've done a radical change in the way that they think about ethics in the last 50 years. I don't even think many people realize, even as people in medicine, like if you went to a doctor 50 years ago, it was always the doctor who decided what course of action you were going to try. And they also oftentimes wouldn't even tell you like facts if they didn't think it would help you. So the most famous example is that they would typically lie to people, particularly women, if they had cancer. Like this, I just find this deeply problematic, right? That they would tell women's husbands that they had cancer, but not the women themselves. There were other famous examples that I'm sure people are familiar with, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where they took Black American men and who had syphilis, and long after there was a cure, they just kept letting the disease run its course so they could find out what would happen, right? And that wasn't exposed in the United States until the 1970s, right? That was an experiment that was going on. And so medical ethics had to come to bear with this notion of, well, you know, we need to do something different. And we at the Naval Academy have kind of looked at this principle aspect as well. This is now also our Naval ROTC programs are going to use the same kind of framework, as is the Naval Community College. And I think you'll see in more and more places that care about applied ethics, people thinking at this level. So the way we break it out is we say the first thing you need to look at is constraints. These aren't legal constraints, they're not physical constraints, they're moral constraints. So as Roger noted, one of these, and as was a really nice point was made earlier, one of these is kind of the equal human dignity and equal worth of all human beings. Rights and justice, dignity are all things that might constrain our ability to act as we want, or to just kind of make the world better. We tell our students to consider this question first, in large part because we worry about them just looking at consequences first and the way that that can trample over dignity and worth and rights. And so we do tell our students to look at these in order, to look at constraints first and then consequences, what's going to make the world better tomorrow, and then special obligations, which are things that, because of our unique history, we might have that other people don't. So those of you wearing uniform, all raised your right hand at some point and took an oath, right? That gives you obligations that I don't have. And it gives you duties that I don't have, right? There might be promises that you made in the past There may be duties you have to your own biological family that I don't have. I just went to visit my parents. That was a duty I had that, I mean, I'm sure my dad would have enjoyed meeting all of you, but it matters more that I did it. And then lastly, character. So what's going to influence your character? What's going to make you the type of person that you want to be? How would a virtuous person act? And we have a couple of questions on this roadmap to just kind of remind us. I like to think of it almost as they all capture a moral theory, and they're meant to capture kind of, I like to think of moral theories as like a set of rearview mirrors. So they highlight a lot of information, but they all have blind spots. And so those questions are ways that hopefully we can see things. Are there any questions on the roadmap itself, or yeah?
Just a illustration. So the Murphy, the Afghanistan goat herd situation case.
Yes.
That actually, yeah. So you would teach the students to think about constraints first, so that they're very first starting with these people, these goat herders have the same rights as all of us, and they're not just like jumping forward to.
They're not immediately
the potential.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So they're not immediately saying, well, let's shove that person in front of the train so they can save 5 people, right? Or let's just not care about them or not view them as equals because it will make the world better, or I'll meet my mission, right?
Right.
And you may notice, and we don't focus on this as much, but the framework does have this delineation in part because, and you notice there's this thing at the after each step, this is morally prohibited, morally required, morally permitted, right? There are lots of things where we have choices, right? So you can choose where to go to lunch today. I don't think that's really a moral decision. I mean, maybe there's some places that are immoral, right? But whether you go to the Big Cheese or Jimmy John's, I don't think is more. I mean, the Big Cheese is better. Aesthetically, there's a right answer there. But in terms of morally, I don't think there's a big moral answer there. So I think there's a moral permission, right? So we do also have this break here, in part because, and I will admit, I stress this more than some, I don't think that your special obligations in character can do it. It has to be morally permitted in order for those to change things, right? So let's say that you want to be, it's a goal of yours to make the Olympics. That's going to require certain character traits that aren't required of all of us, right? I ask my students always to give up something, and have a streak and to make that sacrifice and to see how that happens. And I had one student once who was like not just a midshipman that was like completely racked, but was doing bodybuilding and like took it really seriously. And when he gave up his mustard, right? He's like, sometimes when I have my very prescribed diet, I'm allowed mustard on my turkey, and that seems soft. I think I can go without that, sir. And so, listen, that's fine for him to make that a moral requirement if that's the kind of person that he wants to be. But that's only because that's a permissible thing, right? You can't take on character traits that aren't morally permitted because of human dignity and consequences. And similarly, promises, right? So if I promise to help Tom move this weekend, I'm assuming you've been here a while, so this is an empty promise. I love it. But that would change my moral duties because I would be free to help him move or not before that promise. But if I promise to help Tom rob a bank, right, that wouldn't actually it's not just that would be overridden by all the other moral reasons I have for action, right? I don't have the moral freedom. I'm morally prohibited from engaging in bank robbery, except in, really, really perhaps consequential, like if this is the only way to stop nuclear war, maybe, right? But that's consequences. That's not my promise itself. And so that can't make something morally required. My special obligations are only, the reason why you have an obligation to buy your children Christmas presents and not everybody is because you have that moral freedom already, right? You can't be doing morally prohibited things just because it's your special obligation. So that's another reason why these are lower for exactly that kind of case, right? once again, this is just a framework. It's not a perfect one. Everyone who's going to come up with moral factors is probably going to come up with slightly different ones. We have fights all the time about whether they should be 3 or 5, or what order they should be in. But this is the one that we use, and we do have some reasons for it. Okay. So are there any other questions? Those are all good questions. I want to make sure. So I'm going to ask you to get into the groups and use this to talk about Farsi Island. So that's going to be kind of our next task. So before we do that, let me make sure if there are any questions either on the case or the roadmap itself. I always find telling people what they have to do with something sometimes motivates people. Maybe I don't understand this as much as I think I should.
So I'm just kind of curious because I'm seeing this kind of for the first time.
Yes.
Like, what happens when we apply this roadmap to something like dropping the atomic bomb in World War II?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later to talk about the intellectual kind of framework behind it, right? So you can understand some of the influences, and so you can understand some of the theory behind it. The framework is not meant to provide a specific answer to something that is a general moral dilemma, right? So is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a genuine moral dilemma? Probably, or at the very least, it's something I'm willing to debate with reasonable people on. I've actually done this in the last year, right? And the person who I was debating was, I think, very smart and intelligent and had some interesting things to say, right? So notice, if the consequences are big enough, you might say, listen, that's going to override at least some constraints, right? So if if the most classic example is lying to the Nazi because you have Anne Frank in your attic, right? That's a constraint violation, right? You're not kind of treating that person, respecting everything, right? But the consequences are so grave, right, that you might think that that's appropriate. And that's certainly, I think anyone who recognizes the muck and the mire of the real world is going to recognize that. And this framework is not meant to kind of like give you the right answer. What it's meant to do, and the reason why we introduce our students to it, is it's meant to give them a structure so that they see all the moral reasons and their answers are a little bit more deliberate and full, right? So if, for example, someone argued in favor of dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or let's just pick one because I think it's easier to make the argument for Hiroshima, and they didn't talk about the extreme constraint violations, then I would find something deeply wrong with that answer, right? And if they didn't at least consider the consequences, if they were arguing that it was immoral, even if they made the argument, for example, that it didn't actually make the world better, right? That it had long-term consequences in terms of undermining our authority with respect to the use of nuclear weapons over the rest of our history, right? If they didn't consider consequences at all, then I would find that a problematic answer as well. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Shirley? So it's not, I want to be clear on this, it's not like if you use this, you're going to get one answer on the Farsi Island case. The whole benefit of this is it's supposed to be as agnostic as possible. Now, sometimes I have debates with other philosophers about how agnostic it is. Any model is going to probably have some influence, surely. But we want to try to make that as minimal as possible. If it's a genuine moral dilemma, and Farsi Island, I believe, is a genuine moral dilemma, you should be able to reach either conclusion by going through these steps. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Marcus, is it worth, I mean, for the team, because we're not getting into the tests or the caveats, right?
No.
And so, I mean, that would make, not to get deep in it, but we do unpack,
Yeah, so there is a lot of unpacking about what it is to treat people with dignity, what your rights actually require, right? So your right to be, your right not to be hit changes if you take a swing at me, for example, right? You might think about what actually is the content of your right in many cases. So there's a lot, we do go through more analysis in the class about this. And we look at other principles that fall in these. The other thing that I will say our students are really bad at, and sometimes is the consequential analysis. Oftentimes in like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they'll be like, how many dead versus how many predicted in a land invasion, right? And they don't look at the long-term consequences, right? Even from a brute consequential point of view, it's a lot of actions that people think are justified if you look at the consequences aren't if you look at the long-term consequences, right? So even like, killing a person to take their organs, if a doctor kills a person and takes their organs and gives to 5 people, you might think, hey, that's 1 person dead and 5 people saved. I mean, it turns out if people find out that a doctor did that, they probably aren't going to go to that hospital anymore. And that's going to have all kinds of long-term consequences. It's going to degrade public trust in the medical profession, which is already a problem in our country, right, et cetera, et cetera. So I will say, we do go into a lot of details about all of these. I don't know how much more. I think if anything comes up, we can kind of go into that if we need to. But
I just wanted to
yeah,
make sure that I offered that it's a lot more than what's being presented.
yeah. So there is a lot. There is more detail, especially in constraints, about what a right is, what dignity is, what those require, what justice is. I mean, if anyone figures any of those things out, please let me know. But the most important thing of the framework, and the reason why I think it's important to introduce it to you if you choose to use it, certainly not required, is that your students will see it elsewhere. And the goal is at least to help to start to raise some of those issues, right? And you might say, I've got a case, or what I want to talk about is really just about one of these things. It might just be about what dignity requires. And then, this is probably going to be less useful in a project like that, right? Or if it's just about moral perception, less useful there. But if there's complex things going on, which is the case in at least a subset of moral dilemmas, then this might be useful. Other questions? All right, let's give you at least 10 minutes. So let's go like Jamie to Aaron here, and then we'll go over to Jim, and then the last 4 Tom to Amanda. And so just get in groups, and what I want you guys to do is talk about Farsi Island. What do you think the lieutenant should order? Should he order his people to fight or to lay down their weapons and surrender? And then how do you think what do you think the constraints, the consequences, the special obligations, and character, how are those impacted? Is everybody good on the, all right, so go ahead and go, we'll give you 10 minutes.
So is it the 3 of us?
Yes, and you can join them if you want. Okay. Okay.
So the. Tell the student.
This has
Never
not
to see that. Never. And it's very, very, very rare for such a weak decision. A lot of people violate the rights.
No,
Hey, Jeff or Marcus, could you unmute? Because I'm enjoying the banter. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Hold.
Response.